Well, for more reaction to the plan, I was joined a short time ago in the studio by three of the key stakeholders in the Murray-Darling reform process. Let me just introduce each of you to our audience. Federal MP Tony Windsor is with us from Tamworth. He recently chaired an inquiry into the impact of Murray-Darling reform in regional Australia. From Canberra is Stewart Ellis, the chair of the National Irrigators Council. And with me here in Sydney is Professor Richard Kingsford, director of the Australian Wetlands and Rivers Centre at the University of New South Wales. Welcome to all of you.
Good evening, Leigh.
Good evening, Leigh.
Let me start with you, Stewart Ellis. Today you've been pointing out the difficulties that farmers and regional communities would face if these reforms went ahead. But if authorities don't take steps to ensure the health of the Murray-Darling River system, then won't those farmers and communities face even tougher times going forward?
Leigh, no one understands the need for a healthy environment like farmers do. We live with it, we work with it every day of our lives. So we certainly rely on there being a healthy environment. But our concern with this draft basin plan is just the sheer size of the cuts and the water that will be removed from our regional communities, and about being able to survive with that much less water in the future.
But how do you know that the amount of water that you need is actually viable? Because people have been saying for years that the river has been over-allocated.
Well, certainly within the Murray system, there's already 20% of water entitlements have gone through government buyback, and with the shared component in the draft plan, that means another 970 odd thousand megalitres will have to be recovered out of the southern connected system, being the Murrumbidgee, Murray and Goulburn system. It will leave us with water cuts from our current, where we have been, of some 50%. So there's certainly a critical mass of water required in our communities for those irrigation communities to be able to survive.
Tony Windsor, the government talks about giving equal weight to the environment, to communities and to the economy, but isn't the viability of communities and the economy entirely reliant on the health of the river, and that therefore simple logic would dictate that the environment has to come first?
Well, I think the communities, I'm sure Stewart would agree as well, that it is dependent on the health of the river. The argument may well be over the next 20 weeks about the science and the requirements of some of the environmental icon sites, and that'll probably play out as time goes on. But I'd agree with you that the health of the river is paramount to everybody in this. I think there is a way through this. I think there is a win-win situation that could develop, and given that, from what Craig Knowles has said this morning, that there's 1,400 gigalitres to go, it's not rocket science to achieve that without any removed entitlement, and also some major investment in terms of infrastructure, etc., in terms of water use efficiencies, etc. So you could end up with a situation where the socio-economic impacts are relatively small, and the investment in the communities is relatively large.
Richard Kingsford, we can hear that the disagreement is about basically how much water needs to be returned to the basin. How do we know then who to believe on that when we've got the government saying one thing, environmentalists saying another thing, and then irrigators and farmers saying a different thing? Well,
as I guess Tony was saying, the critical issue is how much water is needed for those environmental assets. These are the Coorong, the major wetlands like the Macquarie Marshes. And we know that we've got that figure of 2750, and I guess the big question is how much will that actually deliver to each one of those icon sites? And is that on the path to sustainability? Now, clearly it's come down quite a bit, but there are some other big questions about the impacts of climate change, what happens with the increased groundwater extractions, and I think all of those will play into some discussion over the next 20 weeks about the long-term path to sustainability.
And do you assess that 2750 figure as being sufficient?
Well, I think this is the big question. Is it really sufficient, and is it going to deliver on the Coorong and the lower lakes? We know they almost dried out during the last major drought, and that caused huge externalities to come into the system. I mean, more than $2 billion was spent on actually dealing with the lack of flow, including Adelaide's desalination plant. So really we don't want to go there again. And I think certainly the science across the basin isn't there for looking at the ecology very well. So we have to rely on the hydrology models. Now, they're very good, but actually linking them to what's happening in terms of river red gums or water birds or frogs, that's much more difficult.
Stewart, Ellis, do you think that there's much more that farmers can do in terms of better irrigation and more efficiencies? Is there much more wiggle room in terms of the technology?
Well, farmers are certainly lining up to take advantage of on-farm water efficiency works, and that's what we've consistently been saying that the government should have been investing in, rather than the non-strategic buyback of water. Now, thankfully, the committee that Tony has chaired has come up with some recommendations there, which thankfully the government now seems to be starting to listen to. But we have a real issue within our group schemes about stranded assets. If they're going to, they've just announced a $1 billion investment further in Northern Victoria irrigation refurbishment project. They're about to announce similar types of funding programs in New South Wales. Now, if they were to go back into the market there and buy indiscriminately throughout those schemes, that's where it has a huge impact on actually being able to deliver efficient and cost-effective water services to the farmers that remain.
Tony, Windsor, let me ask, last year the Murray-Darling Basin Authority recommended cutting water use by up to 4,000 gigalitres. There were enormously angry scenes. We then saw the government say, oh, well, let's get a second report. Actually, the authority now says, oh, actually, we only need 2,750 gigalitres after all. Is this a political fix rather than something that's policy-driven?
No, I don't think it is. There's a review period in 2015 and then the process doesn't fully come into place till 2019. But a lot of this, people are very concerned about the number. A lot of it is about how you deliver the water to the appropriate sites. Stewart made the point there a moment about stranded assets. The Minister has recently said that in the Southern Connected System, the irrigation districts, that the government won't look at buyback and haven't since the recommendations of our report in those districts, so you don't get this stranded asset issue. I think that's got to be taken a little bit further though, and that the buyback, if in fact it does occur, is much more strategic in nature. And that might cost a little bit more money occasionally, but I'm sure in a lot of senses it'll deliver this win-win outcome both to the environment, more effectively managed, and to the irrigators that are petrified of losing their livelihoods.
Richard Kingsford, Tony Windsor there raised the question of what you can do with the numbers that you decide to work with. Do you think that there's a case that the MDBA should have its scientific modelling reviewed by an independent panel of scientists?
Look, it's just been reviewed by CSIRO and some other scientists. Now, they've generally agreed that the modelling is good. I guess one of the concerns that's come out of that is some of the detail. So, you know, how good is the modelling when you've actually got to decide what a Macquarie Marshes will look like, or a Coorong or Lower Lakes? And I guess that's where I think we need tight a bit of work in the next up to 2015 when the review period comes on. I guess I would like to take up a point that Tony made, which is this one of being able to take a whole lot of water and move it to one of these assets. I mean, one of the difficulties we've got here is there's also a whole ecosystem. So, you know, we know our fish move up and down the whole river system. So sometimes it's a good idea if it's ecologically thought about, but you can't just put a pipe in and take water from one place to another if you're going to have a functioning ecosystem. We've actually got to make sure these things are connected.
Gentlemen, lots more to talk about obviously, but we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks very much, Leigh.
Thanks, Leigh.